follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 12, Part 1. Beth finished the final octave of her scales practice. It hadn't gone well that day and she just couldn't concentrate. Scales in fourths kept becoming scales in fifths, which is not a nice sound. More miraculously, the scales in sixths had mysteriously mutated into impressive sevenths. They sounded particularly nasty. She closed the lid on the piano and moved to the kitchen to prepare an early tea before May picked her up for choir rehearsal. Once the visitors were ready, she banged on the service bell and she could soon hear the tinkling sound of Drew cleaning his brushes, ready to come for his meal. "What will you be up to while I'm out tonight?" Beth asked. "I think I'll go back into the studio for a bit to try and get this artwork finished for Conrad. A restaurant in Macclesfield is having a massive extension built and there is to be a huge conservatory around two sides of the building. I've got all of the architectural lines down, but I really want to crack on with the painting. The reflection marks on all that glass will take me ages." "It sounds very grand. What sort of restaurant is it?" "I think it's a traditional English place. It looks a country house type of building set in the outskirts of town. Perhaps I'll take you there when it's finished. I get the idea that we might have to save up a bit first, so let's hope that the building work doesn't progress too quickly." "Now that sounds like a plan. Don't wait up for me tonight. I'm not sure if we'll go on to the Badger after choir or not. I guess it depends upon how rehearsal goes." As they were stacking dishes into the dishwasher, a horn tooted from the driveway. Beth kissed Drew goodbye and left him to finish the clearing up. The Templeton singers were rehearsing for a concert programme entitled Merely Mozart, which promised to be particularly delicious. May had had a quiet word with Betty's first soprano neighbours, warning them to be ready with a judicious elbow during the Gloria of the Coronation Mass to make sure that Betty didn't launch into the soloist part. The guest soprano probably wouldn't be willing to share the limelight, and especially not with Betty. The second soprano sat at the back of the rehearsal hall, where Beth and May had managed to secure seats on the last row of the second soprano section. Of course, there could be no chatting during rehearsal, but they filled the predictably long periods of time in which the musical director was laboriously note-bashing with the bass section by scribbling notes to each other on notepads secreted within their musical scores until it was time for them to sing again. As deputy conductor, May knew that this could go on for a very long time. Years ago, they'd been so tired of sitting idle until the second basses could understand their part, they'd both composed an ode to Brock the Badger, who had died during an episode of The Archers aired at that time. They noticed that this week one of the second altos sitting at the back of the opposite side of the rehearsal room had just got her knitting out. Why was it always the bass section who insisted upon making up the notes and were persistently, no, doggedly dropping octaves? Of course everybody struggled with the music at some point, but it was as if the trudging quality of the bass choral lines affected amateur basses' brains and their musical skills became equally lumbering. Perhaps if they would just sit up straight and not slouch, then maybe their musical rendition wouldn't sag quite so much either. In fairness, the basses probably wondered why on earth the first sopranos found it necessary to screech like so many hags. Beth often wondered the same herself. Nevertheless, even the Templeton singers couldn't quite kill Ave Verum Corpus, and the text in Mortis Examine seemed especially poignant with the death of John Barlow hanging over them. During the break, May broke ranks and crossed over into first soprano territory to thank Betty's neighbour for doing such a great job as incognito voice coach and to see that all was well. The secret of her success was immediately evident by the unoccupied chair where Betty usually sat. The space was disconcerting, as Betty had never been known to miss a rehearsal. As May approached, she could hear that the topic of conversation buzzing along the row was concern over Betty's absence. Eileen usually brought Betty rehearsal, and so May and Natalie sought information from the alto section where Eileen sang. No news was forthcoming as Eileen's seat was also vacant. Nobody had heard why she was absent. The musical director was picking up his baton to begin the second half of the rehearsal, and everybody scurried back to their positions and prepared to start singing. The rehearsal was productive and the programme progressed with relative ease during the second half. A slight tinge of guilt that Betty's absence was at least partially responsible for the success of the rehearsal was only just held at bay. Not quite satisfied to leave things hanging, May and Beth drove to Eileen's house as soon as rehearsal ended, only to find the place in darkness and all locked up. The only logical next step was to drive on to Betty's house. The scene which awaited them there was quite different. All the lights were on, cars were parked up and down the road outside, and the front door stood open. May gingerly knocked on the door and walked on into the house. Neither she nor Beth were prepared for what they next saw. Eileen was sitting in the tall armchair with red eyes from prolonged crying. Dr. Wainwright was stooping to comfort her, and sprawled across the sofa, in what looked a most uncomfortable pose, lay Betty, dead. Dr. Wainwright looked up as they approached and rose to greet them. He appeared relieved at their arrival and was glad to hand over the care of Eileen to the ladies. It transpired that Eileen had come to collect Betty to take her to choir and had found her like this. Not knowing what else to do, she had called Bobby Maddox, who in turn called Dr. Wainwright. It was he who then suggested DCI James be called, and that very person was now on his way to the scene. After a brief discussion, it was decided that Beth and May would escort Eileen back home and then later, regardless of the time, would rendezvous back at Beth's house for nutritional sustenance once they had completed the necessary official procedures. Back in her own house, Eileen let the wave of sadness overcome her, and her tears flowed freely. It was evident that she had been genuinely fond of Betty. It was touching to behold. The three women sat nursing mugs of hot chocolate, and Eileen reminisced over the years that she had known Betty. May and Beth were surprised to learn how long and deep the friendship had been. "I remember when I went to my first WI meeting all those years ago," said Eileen. "Gerald, my husband, had just died, and Betty was the one who picked me up and took me along back then. She was a real lifeline, and I never can forget her kindness to me. I know that she was getting a bit dotty lately, but you could still see the kind-hearted, funny Betty shining through. Do you know what she said to me the other day?" Beth and May gave appropriately quizzical expressions and encouraged Eileen to continue. She was really upset because she'd heard that her grandson's brother-in-law was critically ill. She tearfully told me how he'd been seduced into a coma. I just kept as straight a face as I could and suggested that I thought that this was surely the best way to go that I could think of. The ladies laughed, and now they all had tears in their eyes, of laughter and not of sorrow. "I know she often confused her words," said Beth. "She once told me how painful her various veins could be." They chatted some more, but as conversation became more fragmented, Beth suggested that Eileen might now need to go to bed. With promises of help should she call at any time of the day or night, they made sure that she was cosy and warm and then left her for the time being. May dropped Beth at home and then made her way back to her own home, where Richard would be waiting for her. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.